You're listening to the Archetype Effect, conversations redefining power, purpose and leadership for women and the coaches who guide them. I'm Ros Cardinal, leadership coach and creator of the Women's Leader Archetypes. Together we'll explore the real stories, the research and reflections that help women rise with clarity and authentic power. There's a woman I've met over and over again, in organisations, in coaching rooms, in community groups, in the quieter corners of leadership where the real work gets done. Sometimes she's the formal leader. Sometimes she's the one everyone turns to when the leader leaves the room. She's not always the loudest voice, but when she speaks, people listen. Not because she's trying to impress anyone, not because she's performing confidence, but because what she says tends to be accurate. She sees things early, patterns, motives, the real constraint underneath the stated problem. And it's not mystical, it's lived experience, observation, a mind that notices what repeats, a nervous system that picks up on what isn't being said. She hears the unspoken. She can sit in a meeting where everyone is talking about the plan, and she can feel that the real issue isn't the plan, it's the power dynamics. It's the unspoken fear. It's the one stakeholder no one wants to name. It's the history that's still sitting in the room. She's the person who can say gently, "Can I ask something that might be underneath this?" Not because she's trying to take over, but because she's pointing at the thing everyone can feel, and no one has had the language to touch. This is the wise woman. And I want to say this up front because it matters. The wise woman isn't defined by being smart. Plenty of people are smart. Wise woman energy is different. It's not just knowledge, it's what you do with knowledge. The wise woman shares. She doesn't hoard her thinking like a private vault. She offers it. Not as a lecture, not as a correction, not as a dominance move, as a gift, as a form of leadership. Because the wise woman is motivated by influence, yes, but not the kind of influence that needs a spotlight. Her influence is quieter. It's the influence of developing others. You see it in the way she asks questions, in the way she listens, in the way she stays with someone long enough to help them find their own clarity. She has this extraordinary patience for growth. She can sit with someone who's tangled up in confusion or self-doubt or an old story, and she doesn't rush them. She doesn't rescue them. She just keeps holding the thread, pulling gently, asking again, not because she needs to be the expert, but because she genuinely believes people can become more than they currently see. And when she's in her healthiest expression, that belief isn't naive, it's earned. She's watched it happen. She's seen people rise when they're stretched in the right way. She's seen women find their voice when someone finally listens properly. She's seen leaders soften into their own authority when they stop trying to perform someone else's version of strength. And she finds real satisfaction in that. Not the satisfaction of being needed, the satisfaction of watching capability grow. Because there's a particular kind of power in that, isn't there? When you see someone step into something they didn't think they could hold. And you know you helped create the conditions for it. You didn't take the credit, but you were part of the turning point. That's wise woman power, and it often looks deceptively simple. A question, a reflection, a sentence said at the right moment. But the effect is not simple. It changes how people see themselves. It changes how they think. It changes what they believe they're allowed to do. And this is why the wise woman is so often sought out. People find her after the meeting. They call her privately. They book time in her calendar just for a quick chat. They come to her because she has something that's hard to find. Not just competence, but discernment. And she uses that discernment to create clarity, to cut through complexity without humiliating anyone, to name what matters without becoming harsh, to mentor without making someone dependent. That last part is important because the wise woman doesn't want disciples. She wants strong women around her. She wants people who can think, who can hold their own, who can make decisions without needing her to bless them. And when she's resourced, when she's grounded, when she's not under threat, she actually enjoys that. She enjoys being surrounded by other capable minds. She's not threatened by competence, she respects it. She's not threatened by someone having their own view. She welcomes it. Because wise woman influence isn't fragile. It doesn't need to be protected. It grows through contact. It grows when it's shared. It grows when other people start thinking at a higher level because she helped them get there. And I know some of you listening will recognise yourselves here immediately. You're the one who's asked for input, the one who can see the hidden variables, the one who gets pulled into difficult conversations because you can hold the nuance. You're the one people say things to like, "You're so wise," or "I always feel clearer after I talk to you," or even, "You should be coaching." And sometimes that lands well. Sometimes it feels like recognition. But sometimes it feels like weight. Because the part that doesn't get said out loud is this. When you're the person with that level of discernment, the person who can hold complexity, the person who can see the real pattern, you're not just useful, you're influential. And influence changes the way environments relate to you. Not always intentionally, but subtly. People start leaning on you. They bring you their half-formed thoughts and ask you to make them make sense. They bring you their dilemmas and ask you to name what they can't name. They bring you their strategy and ask you to sanity check it. And because you can, you do. It's not a burden at first. It's meaningful. And it feels like contribution. It feels like being trusted. And the wise woman does value trust. She values wisdom. She values growth. So she keeps showing up. She keeps listening. She keeps offering her thinking. She keeps stretching people towards more. But here's what I want to gently name right at the beginning of this episode. Wise woman influence has a particular vulnerability. Because when your power comes from what you can see, the temptation is to start believing you have to keep seeing everything, to stay ahead, to stay sharp, to keep the thread in your hands, not because you want control, but because your insight has become part of what holds things together. And that's where this story starts to turn. Not because something is wrong with you, but because sometimes the environment shifts. Sometimes the stakes rise. Sometimes trust gets thinner. And when that happens, even the woman who shares her knowledge freely can start holding it closer, not as a decision, as a reflex. And that reflex has a name. We'll go there in a moment. But for now, I just want you to stay here with the wise woman, with the part of you that mentors, that listens, that sees the unspoken, that wants other women to rise, because that part of you is real. And even if she's been buried under pressure, she's still there. There's a moment, and it's rarely dramatic, when knowing stops being just something you enjoy and starts becoming something you rely on. It doesn't happen because you suddenly decide to change how you operate. It happens because the environment does. The stakes rise, the consequences sharpen, something becomes less forgiving than it used to be. And the wise woman feels this shift before she names it. She senses it in the way conversations land, in what gets left unsaid, in the gap between what's officially happening and what's actually going on. She notices that not everyone is acting in good faith anymore, or that decisions are being made elsewhere without context, or that information is being used strategically, selectively, not shared cleanly. And because she sees it, she adapts. not emotionally, cognitively. She thinks a little more carefully before she speaks. She watches reactions more closely. She starts tracking who knows what and who doesn't. This is where knowledge begins to do something else. It stops being just influence. It starts becoming safety. Because knowing more means fewer surprises. It means you can anticipate where something might unravel. It means you're less likely to be blindsided. It means you can see the move before it's made. And for a woman who's learned to trust her perception, that feels grounding. Not controlling, grounding. There's a steadiness that comes from being mentally prepared, from understanding the terrain, from holding the broader context when others are still focused on the surface. And so the wise woman sharpens. Again, not out of fear, out of responsibility, out of care, out of an instinct to protect what matters. She asks better questions. She reads between the lines. She starts connecting dots more actively. And if you're honest, there's a kind of satisfaction in this, being ahead of the curve, seeing the pattern early, understanding what's really driving behaviour. It feels like competence. It feels like maturity. It feels like leadership. But here's the subtle shift that often goes unnoticed when you're inside it. When knowledge becomes safety, curiosity changes. Listening changes. Sharing changes. Not suddenly, gradually. You still mentor, you still support others, but you start filtering what you offer. Not everything needs to be said. Not everyone needs the full picture. Not all context is safe to release. Again, this doesn't feel like withholding. It feels like discernment. And discernment for the wise woman has always been a strength. She knows that timing matters, that nuance matters, that information in the wrong hands can be misunderstood, misused, or flattened. So she starts holding more in her own head. She thinks things through privately before testing them out loud. She refines ideas internally rather than co-creating them early. She waits until something is fully formed before sharing it. And if you've ever been here, you'll know how reasonable this feels. Why invite confusion when you can bring clarity? Why open something up prematurely when you can protect it until it's ready? Why risk misinterpretation when you can control the narrative more carefully? This is not ego. This is not superiority. This is a nervous system doing what it does best when it senses threat. Engaging, staying alert, preparing. The wise woman doesn't freeze when things feel uncertain. She doesn't withdraw. She leans in. She thinks harder. She watches more closely. She becomes more self-reliant in her reasoning. Because somewhere in her experience, she's learned this. If I understand what's happening, I'll be okay. If I can see the pattern, I can navigate it. If I stay mentally ahead, I won't be caught out. And that belief didn't come from nowhere. It was earned. Maybe there was a time when information was used against her, when her words were taken out of context, when her ideas were diluted or credited elsewhere or quietly dismissed. Maybe there was a moment when she realised that not everyone in the room was as thoughtful, as ethical, or as careful as she was. And so she adjusted, not in how much she cared, but in how much she revealed. And from the outside, this adjustment often looks like strength. She appears composed, strategic, unflappable. She's the one who always seems to know what's going on, who's thought it through, who isn't easily rattled. And people respect that. They trust her judgment, they defer to her insight, which reinforces the pattern. Because now her knowing isn't just personal safety, it's organisational safety. She becomes the one others rely on to make sense of complexity, to interpret what's really happening, to hold the bigger picture when things feel messy. And that reliance feels validating. It feels like confirmation that her way of operating is right, that staying sharp matters, that holding context is necessary. But here's the thing we rarely say out loud. When knowledge becomes safety, sharing it starts to feel risky. Not because you don't want others to grow, but because you don't trust the conditions to hold what you know with care. And so, without a conscious decision, the wise woman begins to keep more of her knowing close. Still generous, still supportive, still mentoring, but no longer fully open, no longer fully shared, no longer assuming that circulation is always safe. And this is where the ground quietly shifts, because the same intelligence that once created connection is now being used to create containment, not isolation, not yet. Containment. And containment has a logic of its own, one we need to name carefully, because what comes next isn't a flaw, it's a response, a protective one, and it has a name. There's a particular moment I want to slow down here, because this is where the shift really happens. And it's so subtle that most women don't recognise it until they're already living inside it. It's the moment when sharing stops feeling like leadership and starts feeling like exposure. Not because you become more guarded as a person, but because you've learned through experience that not all environments can hold nuance. Not all people can carry complexity without distorting it. Not all systems reward openness. So the wise woman begins to adjust the way she shares. She still answers questions. She still mentors. She still offers guidance, but she starts editing. She offers the conclusion, not the full thinking. She gives the insight, not the process. She shares the what, not always the how. Again, this isn't conscious strategy, it's efficiency. Why explain the whole landscape when people just want the destination? Why invite debate when the issue has already been thought through? Why open something up when you already know where it needs to land? So she refines her contribution. She becomes more precise, more contained. She holds the complexity internally and releases only what's necessary for the moment. From the outside, this often looks like confidence. She seems clear, decisive, certain. People say things like, she's so sharp, she always knows what to do. She cuts through the noise. And she does. Because she's still thinking deeply, she's just doing more of it alone. This is where the internal load starts to increase. Because when you stop sharing the process of your thinking, you become the sole holder of it. You're the one tracking the nuance, the one holding the competing priorities, the one remembering the history, the politics, the personalities. And because it lives in your head, no one else can fully see it, which means no one else can fully help carry it. But at this stage, it still feels manageable. You tell yourself you're just being thoughtful, just being strategic, just being careful. And in many ways you are, but something important is happening under the surface. The wise woman's influence is starting to move inward, not outward. She's no longer shaping the system with others, she's shaping it for them. And that changes the relationship, because when people receive insight without being part of the reasoning, they begin to defer. They stop offering alternative views. They stop challenging assumptions. They stop co-creating. Not because they don't care, but because the gap in understanding feels too wide. They think, she's already thought about this. She knows more than I do. And on some level, they're right. You have thought about it. You do know more. But the cost of that knowing is starting to concentrate. You're not just influencing outcomes anymore. You're holding the architecture of understanding, and that's heavy. It requires vigilance, because you're the one who knows. You also become the one who must stay right. You can't afford to be sloppy. You can't afford to miss something. You can't afford to be blindsided. So you keep tracking. You keep scanning. You keep refining your internal map. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, something else shifts. You stop inviting people fully inside your thinking, not because you don't trust them, but because you don't trust the process. You don't trust that the nuance will survive. You don't trust that the insight will be handled with care. You don't trust that the context won't be lost. So you carry it yourself. And this is where the wise woman's generosity starts to change shape. She's still generous with support, still generous with time, still generous with advice. But she's no longer generous with uncertainty. She doesn't share ideas that aren't finished. She doesn't think out loud the way that she used to. She doesn't expose the messy middle, because the messy middle now feels unsafe. Too many variables, too much risk, too many ways it could be misread, so she keeps it close. And again, I want to be very clear here. This is not withdrawal. This is not isolation. This is containment, a tightening of the circle around what matters, a narrowing of who gets access to the full picture. And from inside the wise woman's body, this makes complete sense, because containment feels like care. It feels like protecting the work, protecting the outcome, protecting herself. But containment also has consequences, because when your thinking becomes something you carry alone, your influence stops circulating, it concentrates. And concentrated power, even quiet power, changes how systems respond to you. People begin to rely on your judgment rather than developing their own. They wait for your read. They look to you for the final word. And without intending to, you start becoming indispensable. Not because you want to be, but because no one else has been inside the thinking long enough to hold it. And this is the moment where something new quietly enters the room. Not arrogance, not superiority, something far more human, a need for control. Control over meaning, control over interpretation, control over how information moves. Because once knowledge has become safety, letting it move freely feels dangerous. And this is where the wise woman, without losing her intelligence, her values or her care, begins to take on a different posture. One shaped less by openness and more by defence. There's a name for that posture, and it matters that we name it properly. Because it's not who she is, it's how she learned to stay safe. This is the point where the pattern becomes visible, not in identity, in behaviour. Up until now, everything has lived mostly inside the wise woman's head. The scanning, the holding, the quiet containment of meaning. But containment can only stay internal for so long. Because once your sense of safety depends on things not going wrong, your nervous system starts to look for ways to stabilise the environment around you. And that's where control moves outward. This is the lone wolf. Not as a personality shift, as a threat response. The lone wolf doesn't emerge because the wise woman suddenly wants power. She emerges because safety now feels conditional. Conditional on information being accurate. Conditional on nuance being preserved. Conditional on conversations unfolding in the right way, with the right people, in the right order. So the wise woman starts drawing lines, not aggressively, quietly. She starts deciding who needs to know what, who should be in which conversation, what should be shared now and what should wait. She might say things like, "Let's hold off on that for now. I'll handle this one. Let me be in the room when that's discussed. Let's make sure we're aligned before this goes any further." From the outside, this can still look like leadership. It often is leadership. But internally, the posture has changed. She's no longer just offering wisdom, she's regulating risk. Because once she's seen how easily meaning can be distorted, She becomes vigilant about where meaning travels. And here's where the lone wolf gets misunderstood. This isn't about mistrust of people, it's mistrust of systems. It's mistrust of how quickly nuance collapses once it leaves your mouth. It's mistrust of how power operates when context is missing. So she positions herself carefully. She becomes the gatekeeper, not of access, but of understanding. She doesn't want to stop things from moving. She wants them all to move correctly. And correctness is what keeps her safe. So control extends from information to conversations to representation. She wants to be present when things are discussed, not to dominate but to ensure fidelity. She wants to frame issues, not to silence others but to prevent misinterpretation. She wants to manage who speaks to whom, not because she doubts their capability, but because she knows how fragile meaning can be once it's in motion. This is where statements like, "Don't speak to the CEO about this without me," start to make sense. From the inside, that sentence doesn't feel like control. It feels like protection. Protection of the work, protection of the relationship, protection of the outcome, protection of status. Because the lone wolf has learned something important and costly, once something's said, it can't be unsaid. Once a narrative is established, it's hard to shift. Once an idea is framed poorly, it can take months to recover. So she stays close. She inserts herself. She tightens the perimeter. Not loudly, strategically. And because she's intelligent, capable, and often right, this works. Things don't blow up. Missteps are avoided. Outcomes are protected, which reinforces the pattern. The system learns she's the safe pair of hands, and she learns I need to stay involved. This is the feedback loop that solidifies the lone wolf response, not ego, necessity. But here's the cost that often goes unseen. When control becomes the mechanism for safety, trust starts to thin. Not trust in intention, trust in capacity. She stops trusting that others can hold the full picture. She stops trusting that people will act with enough care. She stops trusting that the system can tolerate ambiguity. So she holds tighter. And holding tighter requires energy, constant attention, constant monitoring, constant mental presence. The lone wolf doesn't rest easily because rest requires trust. And trust feels earned only when things don't fall apart without her. So she stays. She watches. She manages the flow. And slowly something painful begins to take shape. She becomes indispensable. Not because she wants to be needed, but because no one else has been allowed or able to fully carry what she's carrying. And this is where the lone wolf starts to feel alone. Not socially, but functionally. Because she's surrounded by people, but no longer feels accompanied. No one else sees what she sees. No one else holds the same level of context. No one else feels the same weight of consequence. And that loneliness doesn't feel like sadness. It feels like vigilance, like responsibility, like being the only adult in the room. And if you've ever been here, you'll know how hard it is to name. Because from the outside, you still look powerful, still respected, still influential, still on top of things. But inside, the experience has shifted. Influence no longer feels expansive, it feels heavy, because it depends on you being present, alert, in control. And control, once it becomes linked to safety, is very hard to loosen. Not because you don't want to, but because it's the lone wolf. Not cold, not selfish, not power hungry, but protective and carrying far more than she was ever meant to carry alone. And that's where the cost begins to surface. Not all at once, but quietly. In the body, in relationships, in the growing sense that influence somehow has started to feel like isolation. There's another shift that can happen here, And this one's harder to talk about because it's the point where the lone wolf pattern becomes visible to others, not just in control, but in presentation. This is where power starts to acquire trappings, not necessarily because the woman wants attention, but because something inside her no longer feels settled. Up until now, safety has come from knowing, from being right, from staying ahead. But when that vigilance has to be maintained over time, when there's no real rest from being the one who sees, anticipates and protects, the nervous system looks for reinforcement. Something external, something that confirms I'm secure, I'm positioned, I'm not replaceable. And this is where self-aggrandized power can begin to take shape, often subtly. The lone wolf may start leaning more heavily on the symbols of her expertise, her credentials, her experience, her proximity to power, her track record. She references who she knows, what she's done, what she's been trusted with, not as bragging, but as evidence, as proof, because internally the ground doesn't feel as solid as it used to. There's a metaphor I find helpful here. Think about the difference between old money and new money. Old money doesn't need to perform wealth. It doesn't need to announce itself. It doesn't display every asset. It doesn't need to be seen as rich. It simply is. New money, on the other hand, often displays. It wears the labels, shows the car, and signals success visibly, not because it's inferior, but because the wealth hasn't yet settled into the body. It hasn't become unquestioned. So it needs reinforcement. The lone wolf can move into a similar dynamic with power. When the wise woman influence is grounded, it doesn't need performance. It moves quietly, confidently, without explanation. But when influence becomes tied to safety, and safety feels fragile, power starts to get shown. The lone wolf may emphasise her seniority, subtly remind others of her authority, position herself as indispensable, dismiss ideas that don't originate with her. Again, it's often without conscious intent. From the inside, it feels like shoring up her legitimacy. From the outside, it can feel like arrogance. This is where the pattern becomes confronting. Because while the lone wolf believes she's protecting the work, others may experience intellectual dominance, exclusion from decision-making, being spoken over, not with, a sense that only one way of thinking is valid. And that's often when feedback, if it comes at all, sounds like, she's intimidating. She always has to be the smartest person in the room. She doesn't really listen. She makes it clear who has the power. And when women hear this, it can land painfully because it doesn't match their self-story. Inside, the lone wolf doesn't feel inflated. She feels responsible. She feels burdened. She feels like the only one holding things together. So when others react to her as if she's dominant or self-important, it feels unfair, misrepresentative, even insulting. She thinks, if they knew how much I'm carrying, if they understood the complexity, if they could see what I see. But that's the point. They can't see it because the thinking lives inside her. And what's visible is the posture, the certainty, the authority, the positioning. So the gap between internal experience and external impact widens. Inside, vigilance and insecurity. Outside, confidence and control. And this is the moment where self-aggrandized power does its real damage. Not because it corrupts the woman herself, but because it fractures trust. People stop offering their ideas. They stop challenging. They stop growing. They defer or they disengage. And the lone wolf reads this as confirmation. See, I really do have to hold this alone, which tightens the loop. More control, more positioning, more separation. And here's the quiet tragedy of this stage. The lone wolf didn't want power for its own sake. She wanted safety. She wanted integrity. She wanted the work and the people to be protected. But now the very strategies she's using to feel secure are creating the conditions she fears most. distance, misunderstanding, isolation. Not because she lacks wisdom, but because wisdom has stopped circulating. And when power is no longer shared, it has to be displayed. That's the turning point. Not yet the collapse, but the place where the pattern becomes impossible to ignore, because even if she can't feel it yet, others can see it clearly. And something in the system has started to push back, not against her competence, but against her centrality. And that's where the cost of the lone wolf power becomes undeniable, not all at once, but in the quiet erosion of relationship, of trust, of shared leadership. And this is where influence, at last, begins to feel like isolation. By the time the lone wolf has moved into this phase, something important has already changed. She's become the centre, not because she demanded it, but because the system has slowly reorganised around her. Decisions route through her, information flows to her first, conversations pause until she's available. She's the one people check with before they act, the one whose reaction is quietly monitored, the one whose absence is noted. And from the outside, this can look like success, influence, authority, power. But from the inside, the experience is very different. Being the centre means there's no place to lean. There's no one above you who sees the full picture. No one beside you who carries the same weight of consequence. No one below you who can genuinely share the load. Everything depends on your presence, your availability, your attention, your capacity to keep thinking clearly under pressure. And that's exhausting. Not the obvious kind of exhaustion that comes from being busy, a deeper one. The kind that comes from never being able to switch off your mind. Because when you are the centre, rest feels risky. If you step back, what will be missed? If you stop tracking, what will unravel? If you're not there, who will hold the nuance? So you stay on, you stay alert, you stay involved, even when you're tired, even when you're stretched, even when part of you wants to step away. And here's the quiet cost. The lone wolf stops being surprised by others, not in a good way. She stops expecting initiative, stops expecting depth, stops expecting people to think at the same altitude, not because they can't, but because they haven't been able to practice. So the gap widens. She becomes more alone in her thinking, more alone in her decision-making, more alone in her responsibility. And loneliness here doesn't look like sadness. It looks like competence. It looks like composure. It looks like someone who has it all together. But internally, something else is happening. There's a dullness creeping in, a sense that work is heavier than it should be, that winds don't land the way they used to, that even success feels strangely hollow, because there's no one to share it with who truly understands the path that led there, no one who saw the trade-offs, the risks, the quiet calculation. And this is where resentment can start to form. Not loud resentment, it's quite subtle. Why am I always the one carrying this? Why do I seem to care more than everyone else? Why does it feel like if I don't hold this together, no one will? And that resentment is frightening because it clashes with the lone wolf's self-image. She sees herself as capable, principled, committed, not bitter, not controlling, not resentful. So she pushes it down. She tells herself she chose this. This is the price of influence, that others wouldn't understand anyway. And that belief that they wouldn't understand becomes another wall. It justifies the isolation. It makes the separation feel necessary. But isolation has a way of speaking through the body, through tight shoulders, through shallow breath, through a nervous system that never fully settles. She may notice she's more impatient than she used to be, less tolerant of mistakes, more reactive to inefficiencies. Small things irritate her, not because she's become difficult, but because her system is overloaded. And here's the part that's hardest to admit. The lone wolf may start to feel unseen, which sounds ironic given how central she's become. But being visible isn't the same as being understood. People see her authority, they see her certainty, they see her success, but they don't see the struggle underneath. They don't see how much she's holding. So praise lands thin. Recognition doesn't quite reach. Because what she wants, often without realising it, isn't admiration, it's companionship. Someone who can see the whole thing with her. Someone who can carry part of the load. Someone who can carry part of the thinking. Someone who can share the weight of knowing. And this is where the pattern becomes unsustainable. Because the lone wolf was never meant to lead alone, her intelligence was meant to be mirrored. Her insight was meant to be shared. Her influence was meant to circulate. When all of that gets compressed into one body, something has to give. Not necessarily in a dramatic way, but in small signals. Fatigue that doesn't lift. Frustration that lingers. A growing sense that influence has started to feel like a burden. And that's the cost of being the centre. Not because power is wrong, but because power without partnership is lonely. And loneliness, over time, erodes even the strongest minds. This is not failure, it's a limit. One the lone wolf will eventually have to face, whether she's ready to or not. There's a moment, often quiet, often private, when the lone wolf begins to sense that something isn't working anymore. Not because things are falling apart. In fact, things may look very successful from the outside. The work is progressing, the outcomes are landing, her influence is intact, but internally something feels off. Influence no longer feels expansive, it feels heavy, and heaviness is a signal. Not that something's wrong with her, but that something has gone too far in one direction. This is where the wise woman starts to stir again, not as a solution, not as a strategy, as a remembering that influence was never meant to be carried alone, that wisdom isn't diminished by being shared, that authority doesn't disappear when others step in. But this remembering doesn't arrive as confidence. It arrives as tension, because part of her still believes, if I loosen this, things could unravel. If I'm not here, it might go wrong. If I let others hold this, they won't see what I see. And that belief has kept her safe. So this is not a simple choice, it's a paradox. The lone wolf knows how to hold power. The wise woman knows how to circulate it. And both are alive inside the same woman. Influence without isolation isn't about abandoning control overnight. It's about noticing the cost of holding everything yourself. It's about recognising that safety built on vigilance alone eventually collapses under its own weight. Because no nervous system can stay in fight forever. No mind can carry infinite complexity alone. No leader can remain the centre indefinitely without paying a price. And this is where the episode needs to end. Not with an answer, not with a prescription, but with an honest recognition that the wise woman lone wolf pattern is not a flaw to be fixed, but a dynamic to be understood. The self-aggrandised power doesn't come from ego, but from insecurity left unattended. That control, when it hardens, stops serving the very things it was meant to protect. And perhaps most importantly, that influence was never meant to isolate you. If it has, something in the system has asked too much of your vigilance, of your intelligence, of your willingness to carry. The wise woman doesn't disappear when the lone wolf takes over. She waits. For conditions where sharing is safe again. For spaces where partnership is possible. For moments when wisdom can move, not as performance, not as dominance, but as connection. And that's where we'll leave it. Not with a resolution, but with a truth worth sitting with. Because recognising the cost of isolation is often the first quiet step back towards influence that nourishes rather than drains. I'm Ros Cardinal. This is the Archetype Effect. Thanks for joining me on the Archetype Effect. If this episode sparked an insight, share it with a woman who leads, or leave a review so more women can find these conversations. Until next time, lead with purpose and power that feels like you.